In this episode, we're going to be looking at the process of photosynthesis. Where we can start is with the actual equation for photosynthesis. So, plants are going to take in 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, and they're also going to take in 6 molecules of water. They are going to use energy from sunlight, or actually any kind of light, and they're going to produce two things. They're going to produce sugar. So the typical formula for sugar is C6H12O6. And they're also going to produce 6 molecules of oxygen gas. So we have carbon dioxide and water going into the system. We use light as our energy source, and then we're producing sugars, which is going to be for energy storage, so we can actually break those down later to get energy in the form of ATP. ATP is not a storage molecule. It is a ready energy supply that can be used right now, but it's highly volatile, and so we can't store large quantities of it. So that's the purpose of making sugar. And then oxygen is given off as a byproduct, and so it's released into the atmosphere. Photosynthesis is all about energy conversion, and so photosynthesis is how we actually take energy from the sun, and we use basically like a solar panel, which in nature is a leaf, and the leaves are used to create organic compounds, which eventually become the organism, like this tree here. So if we really wanted to be exact about it, what we're actually doing is we're taking energy from the sun and we're using leaves to build organic matter. And so it's all about energy conversion. So let's look at how this actually occurs. It all starts with leaves, and right here we actually have a cross-section, a diagram of what a leaf looks like on the inside. And so leaves actually have vascular tissue, just like animals have blood vessels like veins and arteries. Leaves have what we call xylem and phloem, and that's what actually moves materials throughout a plant. But a leaf is chock full of special cells that do photosynthesis, and they have these small organelles inside them. You can kind of see these little green dots here that are called chloroplasts. And it's actually inside these chloroplasts where photosynthesis takes place. So let's actually look down into a chloroplast for just a second. So here what we have is we have a diagram of a typical chloroplast. And photosynthesis is broken down into 2 basic reactions. The first reaction is what we call the light reactions. Sometimes we call that the light-dependent reaction, and that's because it depends on light. This reaction cannot occur without light. The second reaction we call the Calvin cycle, and you can see it here. Sometimes we also call it the light-independent reaction, or sometimes we refer to it as the dark reaction, and that's just because it does not require light. And these happen in 2 different parts of the chloroplast. We have what we call thylakoid membranes, and these thylakoid membranes are where the light reactions occur, and then just all the space that's kind of inside that kind of fills up the chloroplast is what we call the stroma, and it's in this stroma where the dark reactions or the Calvin cycle occur, and we have thousands and thousands and thousands of thylakoid membranes in every single chloroplast, and we're going to kind of break down the light reactions in a little more detail here in a second. But first let's look at the overall reaction. We have an energy source, which is light, and this energy source goes into the light reactions. Energy is absorbed in the form of light by pigments. Pigments are organic compounds that absorb light, and the primary pigment that's used in plants is what we call chlorophyll A. There's also a chlorophyll B, and there's other pigments involved, but this is the main one, and this is what gives plants their typical green color. So it's these pigments that are in the thylakoid membrane that absorb light and use the light energy to produce some things. Some of the things that get produced are actually energy sources themselves. So again, this is all about energy conversion. We're taking energy in the form of light and we're converting it to a couple other energy sources. One of those is ATP, and that can be seen right here. And the other is an electron carrier called NADPH. And basically what these two molecules are doing is they are serving as an energy source to supply the dark reactions. So if you're ever asked what is the energy source for the light reactions, well, that's light. If you're ever asked what is the energy source for the Calvin cycle or the dark reactions, that's going to be ATP and NADPH that were produced in the light reaction. So again, it's all energy conversion. We're taking light and we're turning into these high energy molecules here. Now, light's our energy source, but we have to have raw material. So the raw material that is required for the light reaction is actually water. And water is going to be broken down, and we'll see why that is here in just a second. And as a byproduct, we are going to produce oxygen. So whenever we talk about how plants are giving off oxygen, that oxygen came from water. Now let's turn our attention over to the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle is going to use energy from ATP and NADPH, that energy that was produced by the light reactions, and it is going to take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and through a biochemical pathway, which is just a fancy term that means it's a bunch of reactions that happen one right after the other, we are going to produce sugar. And typically we're going to produce glucose, C6H12O6. So we're taking carbon dioxide, and through this biochemical pathway we are producing sugar. Now, what happens to these high energy molecules once their energy gets used? Well, ATP, it loses a phosphate and it becomes ADP. And NADPH is carrying those high energy electrons, and it actually loses those and it becomes NADP+. And here's what's really cool about this system is it's kind of like a rechargeable battery. We use up the energy from these two guys here, and they become this, and then this gets sent back to the light reactions, and we get energy from light, and we use some raw materials like water, and then we create them again, and then we send them back to the Calvin cycle to make more sugar, and then they go back, and it's just this unending cycle that just keeps happening over and over and over again. So that's the basics of photosynthesis, the two major reactions, but what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the light-dependent reaction in a little bit more detail. Here we have in the top right corner our overview drawing of photosynthesis. We have the light reactions, and here's those thylakoid membranes. And we have water coming in as a raw material and oxygen coming out. We've got light coming in as an energy source. We are creating our high energy molecules, ATP and NADPH. They're getting used in the Calvin cycle to make sugar and being sent back to be re-energized like a rechargeable battery. But let's look at what actually happens in this light-dependent reaction. Over here on this side, we have a breakdown of the light-dependent reaction, and I want you to notice that it consists of two parts. It consists first of, let's see if we can blow this up a little bit. It consists first of what we call photosystem 2. There's actually photosystems, which are just like what they sound. They're systems that use light to do work. And we have photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. Now, photosystem 2 comes first in the series, and that's because it was discovered second. Photosystem 1 was discovered first, and so they named it photosystem 1, even though in series it actually is not the first one to take place in the reaction. So basically what a photosystem is it's a collection of pigments. Again, we talked about how pigments are molecules, organic compounds that can absorb light. And so a photosystem is just a collection of these pigments that's in the thylakoid membrane. So if we look down here, this right here is a membrane. And remember, membranes are composed of a phospholipid bilayer. And these photosystems are embedded inside the membrane. So essentially what happens is energy from light comes in, and excites some electrons in the photosystem. And E negative is just a symbol for electrons. And it gets those electrons all excited, and they start bouncing around from one chlorophyll molecule or one pigment molecule to another until they wind up with the primary electron acceptor, which is right smack dab in the middle of the photosystem. At this point, they have lots and lots and lots of energy, really high energy. And so we run them through what we call an electron transport chain or electron transport system. And we use the energy from that electron transport system to create ATP. So ATP is a result of energy transfer from the sun through electrons in photosystem 2. Now those electrons then make their way to photosystem 1. And the same thing happens again. Light comes in, a photon of light, which is a particle of light, and excites electrons in this photosystem. And then they run through in another electron transport chain, and we use their energy to make NADPH. Here's another diagram of the light reactions, and it may be one that's a little bit easier to read and understand. Basically, we have our photosystem. So here's photosystem 1, and it's made up of chlorophyll molecules. And what happens is light energy comes in and hits that chlorophyll and gets electrons all excited, and they start flying all over the place till they wind up with what we call the primary electron acceptor. Then they get passed through a series of proteins, which we call an electron transport chain, and we use their energy to convert ADP to ATP, which is a high energy molecule. From there, they go to photosystem 1, which is named 1 because it was discovered first, even though it's second in the series. And same thing, light comes in, excites them, and the electrons just bounce all around until they wind up with that primary electron acceptor. Then they go through another electron transport chain, and their energy is used to reduce NADPH, or excuse me, NADP plus to NADPH. And then the NADPH and the ATP are going to be sent to the dark reactions or the Calvin cycle, so their energy can be used to make sugars. Now, one thing I want to point out on this particular drawing is how do we replace these electrons? Think about it. We're losing electrons each time. We're losing 2 electrons, and they're going through an electron transport chain, and then they're going to wind up with this NADPH. But how do we replace them? Well, we use water. And if you will recall, as we looked at originally, it was water that was actually going into the light reactions, and then it was coming out as oxygen. Well, what that water is actually being used to do is replace the electrons that are lost. So we break water apart, and we break it into hydrogen ions, which have a positive charge. And why do they have a positive charge? Because they have lost electrons. And so we break it into hydrogen ions and we break it into oxygen. And those oxygens combine with one another to make O2, which is oxygen gas. And then the electrons go through the system. So it's actually water that replaces those electrons. So we've broken down the light reactions. Now, the Calvin cycle, we could break it down as well. But for this introduction, it's not really something that's necessary. We just need to understand the Calvin cycle is what we call a biochemical pathway. It's a diversity of enzymes that are creating different products, handing off one to another, kind of like an assembly line in a factory. And the end result is that we are producing sugar. So let's do a real quick recap. The whole system is about energy conversion. We are taking energy in the form of light and we are storing it in the form of sugars. So that's ultimately the jump that we're making there. There are 2 major reactions to photosynthesis, the light reactions and the dark reactions. The light reactions take place in the thylakoid, and the dark reactions take place in what we call the stroma, which is all the space inside the chloroplast. The raw material that goes into the light reaction is water, and the byproduct that comes out is oxygen gas. The energy that goes into it is light. The whole point of the light reactions is to make these 2 high energy molecules, ATP and NADPH, and they are used to power the Calvin cycle, which is the dark reaction. The raw material for the Calvin cycle is carbon dioxide, and the product is sugar, sucrose. And the whole system is like a rechargeable battery. These high energy molecules, Their energy's used up, and then they're sent back to the light reactions so that they can be re-energized just like a rechargeable battery.